If you believe that every human being deserves to be treated with kindness, if you have at least once witnessed someone being looked down upon simply because they don't look like someone else, then today's story may touch you. And if these stories of justice, healing, and change make you believe that there is hope in the world, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps us continue to bring honest, humane stories like this one. Now, let the noise die down a bit. Imagine you're standing at Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, on a busy Friday afternoon. Announcements echoed throughout the vast space. The sound of suitcase wheels hitting the floor, children crying for candy, staff calling passengers to board the plane. Occasionally, the smell of hot coffee wafted from the nearby Starbucks. Everything was going as usual, until another sound was heard. A dry, clean, sharp explosion. Pop! An old woman's wooden cane fell to the cold tile floor, rolled a little, and then lay still. Boarding gate 76 suddenly paused for a moment, as if the entire space had been stretched and held tight at that moment. A few passengers turned in surprise. A few others slowly raised their heads, half curious, half confused. Just a few feet away, a flight attendant stood tall as if giving an order. She was young, her blonde hair tied back her uniform perfect to the crease. Her face was proud and sharp, as if she were on the most important mission in the world. Her name was Rachel Carter, and seconds earlier she had knocked an elderly woman's hand away, knocking her cane to the ground. The woman, Estelle Johnson, stood still for a few seconds. Her hands trembled slightly. Her eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with indescribable hurt. "Ma'am, this area is for first-class passengers. You can't stand here," Rachel said, her voice even but loud enough for everyone around to hear. There was no mercy in her voice. There was no doubt that she might be a legitimate passenger. There was no intention to help. There was only affirmation. She did not belong here. And then, in the tense space, a figure stepped forward. A tall, slow-moving black woman in a knee-length gray coat. Her hair was streaked with silver, not salon style, but worldly elegance. It was Ella Hawkins, 58. She carried a small, worn suitcase whose wheels creaked with each step. She did not look like the stereotypical first-class passenger, no designer bag, no flashy jewelry, no bodyguard. Just a woman alone, quiet, calm. But for those who really pay attention, in those eyes as warm and deep as the surface of an ancient lake, there is something that makes others want to slow down. Ella approached where Estelle stood unsteadily. She bent down and picked up the cane with both hands, as if it were something precious. Then she placed it in Estelle's hands, her gaze so gentle that it brought tears to the older woman's eyes. Just a small moment, but enough for those watching to feel something different. Rachel spoke again, this time directed at Ella. "Ma'am, please return to the general queue. This is the priority area." The voice sounded polite, but the attitude was not. Ella raised her head. She looked at Rachel a long time, as if trying to understand what was going on in the mind of a girl young enough to treat a guest that way. But finally she just said, her voice low, warm, and extremely calm, "I know where I stand." It was a sentence so soft that you had to listen to it to understand it, but it made Rachel pause slightly, as if she wasn't used to hearing other people so calm. In the distance, some passengers unconsciously stared at Ella for a longer time. Some even frowned slightly, feeling as if they had seen her somewhere before. Some simply thought there was something majestic about her figure. But then everyone quickly turned away, as people turn away from things that don't concern them. Ella glanced back at Estelle. Her hand rested on the older woman's gentle but firm. Then she stood up, adjusted her coat collar, and walked straight toward the boarding counter where Rachel stood like an invisible barrier. In that moment she felt a slight tremor in her chest. Not fear, but a familiar feeling from a very distant memory, the time when she was young and was turned away at the gate of an airplane simply because she did not fit the ideal passenger model. A light breeze blew through the boarding area, carrying the salty scent of the nearby Pacific Ocean. Ella took a deep breath. Maybe something was about to happen. Something that everyone standing around here, including Rachel, completely didn't see coming. Have you ever seen someone being looked down upon simply because of their appearance? Have you ever remained silent in the face of injustice because you felt you had nothing to do with it? Or have you ever felt the pain of being judged simply by the eyes of others? If so, perhaps today's. The story will remind you of something from your own past, and the journey Ella is about to embark on won't just change one person, it will change them all. In the moment when everyone's eyes were still on Estelle and the stick that Ella had just picked up, no one noticed a small but important detail. Ella had not moved from her position, as if she was waiting for something. Or maybe she was listening to her own heart slowing down because of a very familiar, very old feeling. The silence lasted for a few seconds. Then Rachel crossed her arms over her chest, took a half step forward, her voice stiff. "Ma'am, if you don't get in line, I'll have to ask you to leave the priority area." Rachel's way of saying please sounded more like a command than a request. She didn't shout, but the way she said it made anyone less strong-willed back down. Ella did not back down. She just raised her head, her eyes calm as a windless lake. "I have a first-class ticket. I'm just waiting to be checked like everyone else." Rachel gave a very thin smile, the kind that was hard to tell whether it was polite or sarcastic. "We just want to make sure we follow the rules. There are a lot of people trying to get into this area who don't qualify." The word people sounded vague, but everyone understood what she was referring to. A man standing nearby, a bit stocky in a plaid shirt, frowned slightly. A young woman wearing AirPods silently took hers out. A couple paused in the process of packing their carry-on luggage. No one spoke, but those eyes were drawn back to the center of the story. Ella's face was expressionless, but behind her eyes a stream of memories began to flow. She remembered her 20 seconds, standing in a recruitment hall wearing an old suit, and a manager told her bluntly, "We don't think the management position fits your profile." She didn't mention skin color. She didn't mention gender. She didn't mention poverty. But Ella understood. Today, in this vast airport, that memory returned, not to make her angry, but to remind her of something important. There are wars people face, not because they want to, but because they happen right on their way. She took a slow breath, placing her hand lightly on the suitcase, the way one might place one's hand on one's own shoulder to calm herself. In front of her, Rachel pressed the small name tag on her chest, her voice even. "Please show me your ticket, ma'am." The way she spoke caused a few people to turn around to get a better look. Something in the atmosphere slowly changed, like a current of wind was gathering between two seemingly unrelated people. Ella said nothing. She opened her small purse and pulled out a dark leather wallet. It looked like it had been with her for years. From it, she took out an electronic ticket printed on cardboard, not fancy, but clean and crisp. She held out her hand so calmly that it made the other person feel as if they were the ones at fault. Rachel took the ticket with 2 fingers, the way one holds something of little importance. She looked at the scanner screen. A soft beep sounded. Valid. But Rachel didn't stop. She looked at the ticket, then at Ella. She frowned. "Seat 1. Ma'am, this is the airline president's ticket, not a regular passenger ticket." She smiled faintly, a smile that did not hide her suspicion. There must be some mistake. A few people around gasped. A man blurted out, "She said it was a mistake." No one dared to continue speaking, but the atmosphere had changed. Ella looked at Rachel with a deep, calm gaze, no anger, no judgment, just the patience of someone who understands that the truth sometimes takes time to emerge. "You can check the system again," Ella said softly, her voice small but strong enough to make others want to listen. Rachel wanted to say something, but the boarding pass phone rang. She turned away and picked up the phone. "Gate 76, Rachel Nang." The voice on the other end was urgent. The airline announced that a special VIP will be boarding the flight. "We have to make sure everything goes absolutely smoothly. There can be no mistakes." Rachel glanced quickly at Ella, her eyes lighting up as if she found evidence. "Yes, I understand," she replied, her voice unusually confident. She hung up and walked over to Ella. "Did you hear the call just now? We're preparing to receive VIPs. I really think there's been a mistake here." Ella did not answer, did not react. She stood there, silent but steadfast, like a rock unmoved by the slightest wave. The silence disturbed Rachel. A man's voice rang out from behind. "Excuse me, everything okay here?" A middle-aged businessman wearing a navy suit, polite and courteous. He did not interfere too much, simply asked like a decent person who does not want to see injustice before his eyes. But Rachel just smiled, quashing the idea of intervening. "It's okay, sir. I'm just verifying the information." The way she emphasized the word, I made him hesitate, and then step back, not wanting to make things more complicated. Ella looked at the man and nodded slightly in a silent, "Thank you." It was a small gesture, but it warmed the man's heart, as if she was saying, "I'm fine. Don't worry." Rachel finally handed the ticket back, placing it in Ella's hand with a slightly more forceful motion than necessary. "Ma'am, I need time to check again. Please step aside." That sounded like a reasonable request, but Rachel's eyes said, "Otherwise, I don't believe you." Ella did not step aside. She just asked very softly, "You believe I can't be passenger in seat 1A?" And then, like a needle hitting Rachel's tense heart, she blurted out an answer without thinking. "Ma'am, a VIP first-class guest. Doesn't look like you." No one spoke. No one breathed. No one moved. There is only the truth, lying naked between the two of them without cover. Ella slightly lowered her eyes. A small movement, but enough to make the witness feel his heart tremble slightly. Not because she was hurt, but because of the way she chose to suppress her emotions instead of retaliating. Estelle, the older woman, took a step forward. "What you say isn't right." Her voice was shaky but clear. "I was just treated exactly like that, and it hurts." Rachel was a little startled. She didn't think Estelle would dare to speak up. Ella turned, placing her hand on Estelle's arm. "It's okay. You don't need to be afraid." The way Ella said it made Estelle cry. It wasn't a loud cry, just the gasp of someone who had suffered so much injustice in her life. Some people turn away, not because they don't want to look, but because sometimes kindness makes people feel pain in their hearts. Rachel was confused. The atmosphere was starting to turn against her. Something in the eyes of everyone made her realize that what she was trying to protect was no longer strong. She took a deep breath, trying to regain her familiar strength. "Ma'am, I was just doing my duty. Everyone has to follow the rules." Ella looked at her, more closely this time, more deeply. "I understand your duty, but duty does not allow you to judge anyone based on appearance." Ella's eyes sparkled with a light that made one want to listen and think again. Rachel opened her mouth, but no words came out. A light breeze blew through the large glass doors of the airport, making Ella's gray coat flutter. She stood in the deep, golden light of dusk, streaming into the waiting area. That moment, no one could explain, made the space become unusually solemn. That's when people started to realize, this is no ordinary woman, and this is no small matter. But they still don't know. The fateful turn of events is just minutes away. Just as the tension at Gate 76 was building, a new group of passengers entered the waiting area. They had just come from security and had no idea what was going on. But it took them only a few seconds to sense that something was very different in the crowd. A young man holding a cup of coffee and a laptop whispered to his girlfriend, "See, everyone's standing still. What's going on?" His girlfriend tilted her head slightly, then frowned. "It seems to have something to do with a flight attendant and an elderly passenger. I'm not sure." Little did they know that this story was about to go far beyond an airport argument. It was a moment that touched on a larger question: who deserves respect, and what makes a person truly valuable? In front, Rachel still kept a forced smile, her eyes already wavering. She felt the observation of dozens of eyes around her. But instead of backing away, Rachel clung even more to the only reason she thought could keep her position. She pointed to the words printed on Ella's ticket, her voice low but sharp. "Seat 1A is reserved for the most VIP passenger, the president of the airline, the owner, who you obviously can't be." Some people let out a small laugh. Not a happy laugh, but a laugh of disbelief at hearing something so disrespectful. A young woman standing next to Mark Bennett sighed softly. Why would she say that? Whether it's right or wrong, that way of speaking isn't right. Mark, who had been standing still, looked at Ella with understanding. He had been a senior manager. He could tell that Ella's composure was no accident. It was the composure of someone who had weathered many storms. "She doesn't know who she's dealing with," Mark muttered softly. Estelle Hurd turned and whispered, "If only they would listen to her tell her story. Maybe they would know." Rachel still seemed unable to sense that she was facing something greater. She repeated in an increasingly hard voice, "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the first-class area. If you continue to cause misunderstandings to other passengers, we'll have to call airport security." A small "oh" sounded from a few of the passengers. Not because the decision was bold, but because it was so hasty, so thoughtless. Ella did not blink. She stood so steady that it seemed a mighty storm would not shake her. "You think I'm misleading?" Ella asked, her voice calmer than her breath. Rachel frowned. "Of course. You give people the impression you're a premium passenger." Ella tilted her head slightly. A small movement that made some people shudder. Because I don't look like them. That question rang out like a slash through the wall of silence. There was a long silence. Several people swallowed hard. Rachel was embarrassed but tried to keep her composure. I didn't mean it like that. I was just following the rules. Ella looked deep into the young girl's eyes. No anger, no blame. Just the eyes of someone who has gone through years of being judged by the eyes of others. When you say, someone like me can't sit in seat 1A, that's not a rule, Rachel. That's a judgment. Her voice was so soft that no one would have thought it could have such a strong impact. But the entire waiting area almost held its breath. Rachel pursed her lips. Ma'am, I'll say it again. Our rules are strict. A VIP first-class ticket cannot belong to a regular passenger. A nearby passenger wearing a business jacket turned away. Because that statement sounded like a needle pricking the fragile belief that all men are equal. Suddenly, Ella smiled softly. A gentle, beautiful, and sad smile. If one day the person sitting in seat 1A is an ordinary woman, there's nothing wrong with that. People don't know why that sentence stirs up a wave of emotions in their chest. Maybe it's because it's so true, or maybe it touches on something every adult has faced, the feeling of not being good enough according to other people's standards. A young man standing next to his girlfriend whispered, "She speaks well." His girlfriend nodded, her eyes still on Ella. I don't know who she is, but she makes me want to listen. Rachel was starting to feel a little out of place. Not because Ella was arguing back, she never had. Not because the passengers were backing Ella, they were silent. But because of one small thing, Rachel felt she was in the wrong but didn't know how to back down. That feeling makes people more prone to extreme actions. "Ma'am," Rachel said, her voice stiff with fatigue. "If you don't leave this area, I'll have to report you for non-compliance with the flight attendant's request." Ella gently put her hand in her pocket and took out her phone. "You can do what you need to do. I will do what I need to do." The way she said it made Rachel stop. Not because of the challenge, but because the I in that sentence, it sounded like a footstep of authority without raising her voice. A ground support staff member, a young man named Liam Torres, had just arrived at the boarding counter when he saw the tension in the area. He approached confusedly, asking, "Is there a problem here?" Rachel saw her savior. She spoke quickly, as if afraid someone would interrupt. "The problem is she." She pointed at Ella. "He is trying to enter an area she isn't supposed to." Liam looked at Ella. He didn't recognize her since only the top brass knew the president. But there was something in Ella's eyes that made him hesitate. He asked softly, "Ma'am, do you have a ticket?" Ella handed over the ticket, as calmly as before. Liam swiped once. The screen displayed the words, "Priority access, level A." He frowned. Scanned again. Same result. "This," he turned to Rachel. "The ticket is perfectly valid." Rachel stiffened. Before she could say anything, Liam asked again. "Ma'am, what is your full name?" Ella replied simply, "Ella Hawkins." And in that moment, Liam froze. His face paled. His eyes widened. He looked at the ticket. He looked at Ella. He looked at the ticket again. Then, swallow. You are—" No one heard him finish his sentence. But people standing nearby pieced together what was left unfinished. In those few seconds of silence, Gate 76 seemed to sink. No one breathed. No one turned away. No one moved. All eyes were now on Ella. And Rachel, who had been so confident until now, began to feel the tile floor beneath her feet tilting. The air around Gate 76 froze at Liam's unfinished sentence. The only thing that moved was Rachel Carter's eyes. They darted from face to face as if seeking support from the crowd, but were met with confused, even wary looks. Liam swallowed again. His voice trembled slightly. You are Ella Hawkins." Right, Ella did not answer immediately. She just looked at him with her familiar warm eyes that made people want to lower their voices when talking. "You know me?" Ella asked softly. Liam took a deep breath, trying to calm himself before saying something he never thought he would have to announce in this situation. "Madam, you are the president and CEO of Horizon Atlantic Airlines." The words fell like a heavy stone into calm water. At first, there was silence. Then a few murmurs. Then the crowd began to stir as if a wind had blown through it. "CEO," a man stammered. "You mean she owns this airline? Impossible." A middle-aged woman covered her mouth and whispered, "Is that her?" She looks... The words were caught in her throat, because the woman realized she was about to say something she shouldn't have. Rachel stood there, her face pale as if the blood had stopped flowing. A shiver ran down her spine, the kind you get when you realize you've made an irreversible mistake. No, no way, she whispered. She can't be the CEO. No way. Ella tilted her head calmly. What makes you believe I can't? The question wasn't asked aloud, but it made Rachel feel as if someone had pulled an invisible string tight around her chest. Rachel's eyes blinked, rapidly panicked. I've never seen you in training materials. Ella nodded, slightly strangely calm. You don't know me. That's fine. But what I want to understand is, why did you believe I couldn't be a first-class passenger in the first place? Rachel took a half step back, not answering, because she knew if she spoke out, it would be the truth that she herself was afraid to face. Liam didn't want to make things awkward for Rachel, but it was his duty to do the right thing. Madam, could you please give us one last verification? He said, his voice low but respectful. Ella nodded. She pulled out her phone and handed it to Liam. The screen displayed electronic documents with the company's internal digital signature. Liam looked at it, and after a few seconds he let out a sharp breath, like someone who had just escaped a situation where he had almost messed up badly. That's her exactly. He turned to Rachel. Mrs. Hawkins is the head of the company. The air exploded, but in silence. A young passenger whispered, "Oh my God, what did the flight attendant do?" An old man sitting near the boarding gate slowly shook his head. There are mistakes. That can be seen at first sight. Estelle, the older woman, gently took Ella's hand. I knew you were no ordinary person, just from the way you looked at me. Ella smiled gently. I'm just a person like everyone else. That made Estelle cry a little more, because sometimes kindness softens people's hearts in a very strange way. Rachel trembled. Her fear wasn't from being disciplined. It wasn't from losing her job. It was from facing herself. She whispered, Why? Why didn't you say from the beginning that you were the CEO? Ella looked Rachel straight in the eye, a look she couldn't look away from. If a person is only respected when they reveal their power, then that is not respect, Rachel. She didn't answer, not because she didn't want to, but because her throat was closing up with the obvious truth. A group of passengers automatically made way for Ella to approach the boarding counter. No one was told to, but they stood aside, as if a silent passage had been opened out of respect for her. Rachel remained standing, her hands hanging limply. She was so confused that she didn't know where to put them. Ella stopped in front of her. Do you know the most painful thing? Her voice was as light as the wind. Rachel looked up, eyes red. Ella continued, You didn't do wrong because you hated me. You did wrong because you thought you understood me, just for a few seconds on the surface. Rachel pursed her lips, tears falling uncontrollably. I'm sorry, I don't know. Ella raised her hand, not in reproach, but as a gesture that wanted someone to hear the truth. The most important thing is that I'm not the only one who has been judged like that. There are millions of people out there, Rachel, every day. The two words every day made some people bow their heads, because they understood, because they had witnessed it, because they had been silent. Mark Bennett stepped forward, speaking clearly for the first time. Ma'am, I'm so sorry for what happened. On behalf of, I don't know, those who were silent like me. Thank you for standing firm. Ella just smiled slightly. When we remain silent in the face of wrong, we inadvertently become its partner. The statement made several people gasp. It was as if they had just touched upon something they had long avoided thinking about. Rachel wiped her tears and tried to regain her voice. Mrs. Hawkins, I'm sorry. I really have no excuse for my behavior. Ella nodded. I accept your apology. But an apology only means something if you know what you need to change. Rachel bowed her head. Not because she had to, but because in that moment she knew she had met someone who made her see herself more clearly than ever before. An announcement came over the airport loudspeaker. Flight HA 417 is preparing for boarding. First-class passengers, please proceed to the gate. All eyes turned to Ella, not because she was the CEO, but because she had just taught them a lesson without lecturing. She just smiled and walked to the boarding entrance. And just as she was about to put her hand on the ticket scanner, a hurried voice rang out from behind. Wait, let me talk to you for a moment. It was a familiar voice, tense, shaky, hopeless. Rachel Carter. Ella paused, not turning around immediately, as if waiting to see what Rachel would choose next. Some passengers held their breath. It feels like a big chapter is about to open. The announcements continued to blare from the airport's high ceiling, but for those standing at Gate 76, all the sounds outside seemed distant. There was only one thing they could clearly feel: the tension surrounding flight attendant Rachel Carter, who had just run after Ella, breathing heavily, and her eyes filled with fear. Ella stopped just before the boarding gate, her hand still on the strap of her suitcase. She didn't turn around immediately. There was something about her silence that made everyone around her unconsciously keep their distance, as if they were standing in a sacred place where only the truest words were allowed to be heard. Rachel swallowed hard, her shoulders shaking slightly. "Mrs. Hawkins, please give me a minute." Rachel's voice was small but clear in the large space. Ella turned around. Her eyes were as calm as the surface of a lake before the sun had even woken up. "What do you want to say?" Her voice was soft without a trace of reproach. Rachel took a deep breath as if to gather all her remaining courage. I need to apologize to you. Not because you're the CEO, not because I'm afraid of being disciplined, but because of how I treated you, Estelle. People who I deemed unfit to enter this area." She stopped, her voice catching in her throat. "It turns out, I'm the one who's not qualified." Some people bowed their heads when they heard that. Some pursed their lips as if swallowing an indescribable sympathy. Ella said nothing, but her silence was permission for Rachel to continue. "You know," Rachel looked down at her hands, "when Liam confirmed your identity, I felt like the ground disappeared from under my feet. Not because you had power, but because I realized that I had seen you the way society had seen my mother." The statement startled some passengers. Rachel held back a sigh. "My mother is Cuban. She speaks good English, she is smart. But because of her appearance, her accent, her skin color, people always thought she was a worker, not a high-class customer. And I hated that so much." Rachel's eyes were red. "And yet today, I was the one doing the same thing to someone else." Ella tilted her head slightly, her eyes softening, as if she were looking at a young person struggling to come to terms with herself. An old man leaned on a small stick next to the boarding door and said softly enough for a few people to hear, "She is facing the truth that many people avoid all their lives." Estelle stood in the crowd, wiping away her tears. Everyone who witnessed it understood that Rachel's apology was not the usual kind of apology, the kind that just finished so they could move on. It was an apology that made the speaker peel off her own skin. Rachel tried to hold back the tears but failed. "Mrs. Hawkins, I was wrong. And the scariest thing is that I can't say I was wrong because I didn't know. I know. I saw it. I hated it. And I still became it." A gentle breeze blew through the large glass windows. Ella's hair swayed slightly. She took a step closer to Rachel, not to lecture, not to emphasize the status difference, but to let her know that this moment wasn't a punishment, it was an opportunity. Ella spoke softly, but her voice was clear. "Thank you for telling the truth. The truth is always the starting point of change." Rachel pursed her lips, tears rolling down her face. "Please, if possible, give me a chance to make things right." Ella looked at her not with anger or judgment, but with someone who had lost faith many times but still chose hope. "The opportunity didn't come from me," Ella said. "It came from you when you chose not to be the person you hated." A few people in the crowd nodded slightly, not in agreement, not in support, but because they felt the same way about him. But the conversation doesn't stop there. From behind, a man with a brisk gait walked towards them. Silver gray vest, cream shirt without a wrinkle, the appearance of someone familiar standing in an executive position. It was Gregory Shaw, the airline's regional operations manager. He had just received the information from Liam and immediately headed to the gate. "Sorry, I'm late," Gregory said, bowing slightly when he saw Ella. "Mrs. Hawkins, I am terribly sorry for what happened here." Rachel was startled. She didn't expect a high-ranking executive like Gregory to show up. Gregory continued, "We will report the whole incident and handle it according to procedure." Ella raised her hand slightly. Gregory immediately fell silent. "There's no need to rush," Ella said. "Mistakes should not be made in anger." Rachel lowered her gaze, grateful to not be humiliated in front of the crowd. Gregory looked at Ella, then at Rachel, his eyes a mixture of responsibility and compassion. "Anyway, Mrs. Hawkins, it was our fault that this happened. If you want to suggest disciplinary action," Ella interrupted again, gently but firmly. There are lessons one can only learn when one still has a chance to get up. No one deserves to be eliminated just because of a stumble. Everyone around fell silent, a silence that softened the atmosphere. Rachel covered her eyes and cried, not because she was afraid anymore, but because she had never heard anyone forgive her like that before. Gregory stood up straight and nodded. So, what do you want us to do? Ella looked at Rachel for a long time. Then she said, let her start over, but with harder work than today. Rachel opened her eyes and looked up. Ella continued, give her first-class service on this flight, not to punish her, but to let her learn that people are not judged by how they look, but by how they are treated. A small "oh" went through the crowd. Not in mockery, but in amazement and admiration. Gregory thought for a few seconds, then nodded. I will arrange it. Ella turned back to the boarding gate. She inserted her ticket into the scanner. A beep sounded soft but resonant, like the start of a new chapter. But before she entered, Rachel spoke again. This time without trembling, without panic, but with such sincerity that it would make a stranger want to stop and listen. Mrs. Hawkins, I promise, I will do right today. Ella turned back, smiling. A small but warm smile that made anyone who saw it want to live a kinder life. I know, Ella replied. And remember, don't do it for me. Do it because you want to be a better person than you were yesterday. The boarding door opened. The orange light of sunset fell on Ella's face. She walked into the boarding area. A light step, but one that carried the weight of a story that everyone at Gate 76 would never forget. And Rachel stood there, hand on her chest as if feeling her heartbeat again. Painful, relieved, and changed. As Ella stepped through the boarding door, the commotion behind her gradually died down. But if anyone paid close attention, they would notice. Ella's posture was no longer as leisurely as before. She still stood straight, still walked slowly, but with each step there was a heavy silence, as if something inside her had just been stirred up. Not anger, not pride at being respected, but an old, very old pain long dormant awakened. The long boarding corridor, the white lights running along both sides, reflected off Ella's gray coat. The wheels of the suitcase rolled softly and evenly, but each sound echoed like a beat of memory unfolding. Outside, Rachel stood still. She watched Ella's retreat as if she were looking down a path she never expected to take, a path that led to the very part of herself she had always avoided. She was strong. She was confident. She thought she understood the world. But in just one afternoon, all that belief collapsed like a tower built of sand. Just a breath of truth. Today changed me. Rachel thought, her shoulders slumping. On the plane, the atmosphere was much quieter than outside the boarding gate. The soft yellow light on the cabin ceiling created a warm, intimate feeling like the living room in an old house. Seat 1A, Ella's seat, was in the very front row. She stood there for a few seconds, resting her hands on the back of the seat as if to steady herself. Are you okay? A soft voice came from the back seat. It was another stewardess, Mira Collins, her face gentle and her eyes full of respect. Thank you, Mira. I'm fine, Ella replied, but her voice was so soft it sounded like it came from a weary heart. Mira looked at her for a few more seconds. The look of someone who knows that I'm fine is sometimes just a coat worn to keep others from worrying. Mira said softly, if you need water blankets or anything, just let me know. I'm right here. Ella nodded, smiling, and the smile, though fragile, expressed deep gratitude. When Mira left, Ella sat down in seat 1A. Her back hit the soft cushion. Her hands rested on the armrests. Her eyes were on the cabin wall ahead. And just then, with no eyes on her anymore, Ella's eyes fell, not from humiliation, not from the hurt of Rachel's words, but because the old memories came back so clearly. When Ella was 22, she stood in an office interviewing for her first airline. Her suit was a thrift store second-hand. Her shoes were a little tight. Her hair was in a bun, imperfect but neat. The interviewer, a white woman, looked at her for exactly 4 seconds and then asked, "Are you applying for ground staff or cleaning?" Ella remembered that moment clearly. She remembered every sound, every look, every heartbeat, trying to act strong. She replied, "I applied for a supervisory position." And the woman laughed, a long, thin, mocking laugh. That afternoon, Ella walked home for more than an hour in the cold, her hands numb, her shoulders heavy as if they were loaded with stones. No one hit her, no one pushed her, but she was in pain, an invisible pain. Now, in the quiet cabin of her own luxury plane, the pain of that day resurfaces, not to weaken her, but to remind her that the path she has taken has not been easy. Ella closed her eyes. A long, slow breath fell from the bottom of her lungs. She whispered to herself, "No one deserves to be looked down upon just because they don't look like someone else's expectations." Her voice was as light as the wind, but enough to make her heart beat deeply. A light knock sounded at the head of the chair. Ella opened her eyes. Rachel stood there, neat uniform, hair tied up. Gone was the arrogant confidence from the boarding gate. Just a young man, standing before the person he had hurt. "Mrs. Hawkins," Rachel said softly. "I, as assigned by the board, will be serving first class on this flight." Ella looked at her for a few seconds, then said, "I know." Rachel took a breath, trying to keep herself from shaking. "May I serve you as best I can?" Ella studied Rachel for a long moment. Her eyes, no longer sharp, were thoughtful. "Do you think you're ready for that job?" Ella asked softly. "This question is not about the business. It is about the people." Rachel bowed her head. "I'm not sure, but I want to learn. I want to make things right." Ella nodded slowly, like an older person who understood that change is a long journey, and sometimes the first step is daring to stand up to the person you hurt. "Okay," Ella said. "You have a chance." Rachel bit her lip to keep back tears. Not from embarrassment, but from the fact that she wasn't used to being treated kindly after a mistake. In first class, there were only a few minutes left before the other passengers boarded the plane. The breathing of the whole space seemed to slow down. Amidst the slowness, Rachel asked Mrs. Hawkins, "I want to understand what makes you so calm. When I offended you, you didn't get angry." Why? Ella thought for a few seconds. When you have experienced contempt enough times in your life, you will understand that anger is not the way to make the world a better place. Rachel was silent. Ella continued, "But calm does not mean painless." The words made Rachel look up, and for a moment she saw something she hadn't seen in Ella since the beginning. A very human vulnerability. Not a breakdown. Not a disappointment. But the fact that even the strongest people have their own scars. A loudspeaker rang out. "We are about to close the aircraft in a few minutes." The space was quiet again. Rachel bowed deeply. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity." Ella nodded. "Don't let that opportunity go to waste." Rachel turned and walked toward the counter. She was small in the cabin light, but with each step she seemed to be learning to stand up straighter. Ella remained sitting there, hands on the back of the chair, eyes staring straight ahead. Outside the window, the Los Angeles sunset was a dying flame, but inside Ella something lit up. Not the light of power, but the light of someone who knows that life can only change if we are patient with our own pain. The plane was preparing to pick up the last passengers. The cabin lights were dimmed to a warm glow reflecting off the first-class seats, giving the whole space a peaceful luxury. But within that peace, both Ella and Rachel sensed that today was not over. Something has yet to happen. Something big. Something that could completely change the course of the story. Ella sat quietly in seat 1A. Her posture was straight but relaxed. Her eyes were slightly closed as if she was listening to her own breathing. Rachel across the table was going through every serving tray, every napkin, every glass. Her hands were shaking slightly, not because she was worried about doing something wrong, but because she wanted everything to be perfect. It was the only way she knew how to make some kind of repair to what she had done. Mira, the gentle flight attendant, looked at Rachel for a long time, and then said softly, "No one expects you to be perfect." Rachel stopped and took a deep breath. "But you have to try. Not just for her sake, but for yourself." Mira smiled slightly. "Then, try. But don't forget to breathe." The plane door opened again. And at that moment, every little movement in the first-class cabin seemed to stop. A tall man entered his black suit, perfectly tailored to every seam. His face was sharp, his blue eyes deep and unreadable. The kind of eyes of someone used to standing in conference rooms where even silence could make others wary. He is Mark Sullivan, Executive Vice President of Horizon Atlantic Airlines. To those in the aviation industry, Mark Sullivan was more than just a boss. He was a symbol of discipline, strategy, and uncompromising sharpness. Rachel saw him and stood up straight, hands behind her back, heart pounding as if it was trying to jump out of her chest. Mira whispered, "Oh my God, why is he on this flight?" The other flight attendants were nervous. Mark was not one to make mistakes. He must have heard about it at the gate. Only Ella remained still, her eyes open, looking at Mark with a completely calm gaze. Mark approached Rachel first. "Are you Carter?" His voice was low, not loud, but each syllable was as sharp as a knife just off a whetstone. Rachel stood at attention, her voice trembling. Yes, sir." Mark looked her straight in the eyes. Just for a second, Rachel felt dwarfed by the weight of power. "Looks like you had a memorable afternoon." Rachel did not dare to speak. Mark continued, "And it seems like the whole company will remember this afternoon for a long time." The air was thick, as if someone had sealed all the windows, leaving only one way for the storm to rush in. But then the unexpected happened. Mark turned his gaze to Ella, and instantly, this seemingly hard man, his expression changed completely. He bowed. Not a perfunctory bow, but a bow of deep respect. "Mrs. Hawkins, we've been looking for you for almost an hour." His voice was low and sincere. "I apologize for the unfortunate incident that occurred." She didn't answer right away. Ella looked at him with a silent gaze, as if asking a question without needing to speak it aloud. Why should he apologize? Why is this so important? Mark seemed to read something in her eyes. Because no one, in any position, deserves to be treated the way she was treated. A small sigh came from someone in the first-class cabin, probably Mira. A simple sentence, but it touched the softest part of the human heart. Mark turned to Rachel. His eyes were no longer cold, but heavy. "Miss Carter, I reviewed the entire report from Gate 76. Rachel felt her hands go cold. She struggled to stand. Mark continued, "But I also heard that you tried to make it right afterward." Rachel opened her eyes, surprised. She hadn't thought anyone would mention it. She hadn't thought that little thing would be noticed. Mira glanced at Rachel, smiling slightly. Mark took a deep breath, as if he could feel the fatigue of the day, too. "Miss Carter, I won't make any decisions while Mrs. Hawkins is here." He turned to Ella. "Mrs. Hawkins, how would you like us to handle this? Your opinion is important." Rachel almost held her breath. The other flight attendants stood still, waiting for an answer. The whole cabin fell silent, a kind of silence that can make one's heart skip a beat. Ella looked at Mark for a long time. Then she replied softly, "I'm not here to punish anyone." The 2 rows of seats in the back moved slightly. Several people sighed, not in relief for Rachel, but because kindness had the power to soften hearts. Ella continued, "But I believe in responsibility. I believe in learning from mistakes, not so that someone gets hurt, but so that no one else has to." Mark nodded, his eyes changing, from sharp to genuine respect. "So, what do you propose?" Ella leaned back in her chair, her hands on the armrest of chair 1A, her voice slow. "Let Miss Carter serve this flight. Watch how she treats the other passengers. And after the flight, let her undergo the refresher training program I suggested at our meeting last year." Rachel's eyes widened. She realized she had given her something she didn't dare ask for a second chance. Ella continued, "People only change when they understand why they need to change. No one can teach them that through fear." Mark stood still for a few seconds, then he nodded deeply. "Yes, Mrs. Hawkins." As he was about to leave first class, Rachel called out softly, "Mr. Sullivan." Mark stopped. "Thank you for acknowledging my attempt to correct my mistake." Mark looked at her, his eyes serious but warm. "Miss Carter, opportunity is a privilege, but writing is a choice." Then he turned and walked out of the plane. The cabin door closed, the lights dimmed. Ella looked out the window, where the last rays of sunset were fading behind the Los Angeles skyline. There was no longer any pain in her eyes, only the calmness of someone who knew her storm had passed. And another storm, for young people like Rachel, is just beginning. But it is a storm of growth, not of collapse. As the plane closed its doors and taxied down the runway, the cabin lights dimmed, creating a surprisingly peaceful atmosphere. But beneath the calm, a question lingered like a shadow that never left the minds of those present. What really happens after this flight? Ella Hawkins sat quietly in seat 1, her hands clasped together gently. She didn't need to look to know Rachel was standing behind her, trying to keep her breathing, even trying to keep her hands from shaking. No one said anything, but everyone could feel the invisible waves that were about to break as the plane landed. The New York evening air was chillier than usual. After the passengers disembarked, Mark Sullivan returned to the cabin, his eyes signaling something no one could refuse. "Mrs. Hawkins, the temporary meeting room is prepared." Ella nodded. No one knew that in that moment, distant memories had returned to her mind, memories of the times she had been invited into the temporary meeting room when she was younger, not to discuss business, but to explain why she was unsuitable. That day, she was silent. Today, everything is different. Meeting Room 3, Gate B12, JFK Airport. The room was not large. Round table, white lamps, cold gray walls. The air smelled more of a tense meeting than a normal conversation. Rachel was asked to go in last. She clenched her fists, took a deep breath, and stepped in, but her legs almost refused to obey. In the room were Mark Sullivan, 2 members of the Human Resources Oversight Board, and in the middle, Ella Hawkins. Ella looked at Rachel without judgment, just silence. But it was the silence that made Rachel's knees buckle. Mark spoke first. "Miss Carter, before we start the formal meeting, Mrs. Hawkins would like to have a brief discussion with you. No recordings. No minutes. Just a human conversation." Rachel looked up, her eyes red. I'm ready." Mark nodded and walked out, leaving Rachel to face Ella directly. As soon as the door closed, the conference room became strangely quiet. Rachel could feel her heart beating louder than the air conditioner. Ella didn't look at the report, didn't look at the file, didn't look at the papers that described Rachel's mistake. She just looked straight at her. "Miss Carter." Ella began, her voice soft, but each word seemed to put an inescapable weight into the air. "What happened today?" Rachel opened her mouth, then closed it. She had rehearsed her answer in her head, but when she looked into Ella's eyes, it all vanished. I don't know." Her voice broke. "What I did was wrong. Completely wrong. I have no excuse." Ella tilted her head as if waiting for something deeper. Rachel tried to continue. "I thought I was following the right procedure. I thought I was protecting the company's standards. But I was really just protecting my own prejudices." A tear fell on the table. I looked at her, and I saw someone who didn't look like the first-class passengers I was used to serving. I didn't say it, but I thought so. And then, I acted like that. Ella didn't answer right away. She tapped her hand lightly on the table, as if feeling the pain of her own past. Then she asked a question that almost took Rachel's breath away. "When you tore up my ticket, did you think I was a cheat?" Rachel nodded. Slowly, shamefully. "Yes." Ella closed her eyes slightly. "Just a second, but that second feels like a lifetime." When she opened her eyes again, her voice took on a different tone, deeper, quieter, but stronger. "Miss Carter, do you know how many times I've been through this in my life?" Rachel shook her head. "Too many times to remember them all." The atmosphere was so heavy that Rachel wanted to apologize immediately. But Ella raised her hand lightly. "Don't apologize yet. Listen." Ella leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on Rachel, opening a door to memories she had kept hidden. "When I was a young financial advisor, I was pulled out of a meeting room by security because they thought I was lost. When I became a director, someone said I was promoted because the company lacked diversity. When I became CEO, people still asked me if I really understood how to run an airline." She paused, her voice slowing down. "But no one ever tore up my ticket." Rachel covered her mouth, tears welling up in her eyes, not because she was afraid of punishment, but because she had just seen something she had never seen before in her life, the weariness of someone who had suffered injustice for too long. After a long while, Ella continued, "Miss Carter, your responsibility is not just to serve the passengers, it is to see them as human beings, a person with a story, with fears, with wounds, with hopes." She put her hand on her chest. "Like me." Then, she placed her other hand on the opposite spot where Rachel's heart was pounding. "And like you," Rachel choked, I want to change." Ella smiled slightly, a rare smile, non-judgmental, non-reproachful. "You will change, but not because of me, because you know you need to." The conference room door opened. Mark Sullivan walked in. "Mrs. Hawkins, shall we begin?" Ella stood up. But before leaving the table, she put her hand on Rachel's shoulder. A light touch. But it made Rachel burst. Ella said softly, but enough for Rachel to remember for the rest of her life. Pain is not to make you fall. Pain is to make you see yourself clearly. The meeting officially began. But Rachel Carter's story changed before the meeting even started. Not for the minutes, not for the verdict, but for the first time in her life, she saw the person behind a CEO and the person behind herself. A new chapter is about to unfold not just for Rachel but for Horizon Atlantic Airlines as well. Because sometimes, a mistake big enough is not meant to be punished, but to awaken a collective. And the biggest question, the one audiences will have to wait for next season, remains unanswered. Ella Hawkins. What will she do next? Conference room number 3 still maintained the silence typical of places where decisions that could change someone's life were made. Outside, the faint sound of the airport loudspeaker echoed in the distance, mixed with the sound of luggage being dragged and the familiar phrase, "Please proceed to the gate." But inside this room, time seemed to stand still. Ella Hawkins sat in the center of the round table. Mark Sullivan sat to her right. 2 members of the Personnel Oversight Board sat across from her. Rachel Carter sat alone. No lawyer, no one else beside her, just her tightly clasped hands, the last rope holding her upright. No one spoke. No one wanted to start. But Mark Sullivan was the first to break the silence. "Thank you all for coming. We will review the incident that occurred at Gate 76 and in first class on Flight HA 217. Rachel avoided Mark's eyes, but she knew she was the focus of every conversation. Mark continued, "Before we decide anything, we need to hear the whole truth, not just from the report, but from the people who were present." He turned to Ella. "Mrs. Hawkins, would you like to start first?" Ella didn't answer right away. She touched the wooden tabletop lightly with her fingertips, feeling the grain, a habit she had whenever she wanted to put her mind in a neutral position. "Okay," she said softly, but her soft voice carried such force that everyone in the room sat up straight. "This afternoon," Ella began, "I simply want to board the plane as a regular passenger." She didn't ramble. She didn't talk about the anger. She didn't talk about the humiliation. She just told the truth in a voice so calm it hurt all the more. When Ella got to the part about Rachel tearing up the ticket, Rachel bowed her head deeply. Even Mark Sullivan frowned, even though he had seen the report, heard it directly from the security guard, but when he heard it from Ella herself, the atmosphere was much thicker. After a long while, Ella ended with a sentence that made the whole room fall silent. "I am not asking for punishment. I am asking for understanding." One of the 2 staff members, Miss Linda, leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Hawkins, what do you mean?" Ella looked straight at Rachel and replied, "I don't want a young person to lose their career because of one mistake. But I also don't want that mistake to happen to someone else." "Mrs." Linda nodded slightly, and Mark watched Ella with an unreadable look, not surprise but a rare respect. "Miss Carter," Mark called. Rachel stood up. Just the act of standing showed that her legs were about to collapse. "Tell me the truth, your wishes, and what you think you deserve." Rachel took a deep breath. She had prepared 100 ways to say it. But in the end, the only thing that came out was the most honest "I accept any form of discipline." The room was silent. Rachel continued, her voice trembling but not evasive. "I judged Mrs. Hawkins by her appearance. I used my power to defend a wrong idea, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it." Tears fell down, but she didn't wipe them away. Because wiping or not wiping was no longer important. "I'm not asking for my job. I'm asking for the chance to be someone who doesn't put others through what I did today." The room was silent. A heart-wrenching silence, not from anger, but from obvious sincerity. Mark Sullivan opened the file but closed it immediately. He looked at Ella. "Mrs. Hawkins, final decision. Which way do you want it to go?" Ella looked up at Mark, her eyes soft but sharp as an experienced knife. "Discipline is necessary, but the ultimate goal of discipline is not to eliminate, but to improve." She continued, her voice deep, "And even I recommend that Rachel Carter be suspended for 3 months. After that, she must complete advanced training in multiculturalism, ethics, and crisis management. When she returns, she will undergo 6 months of on-site supervision. If she passes, she stays. If she doesn't, she leaves with honor." Everyone almost held their breath. No one objected. No one dared. Because it's not just a decision. It's a philosophy. Ella Hawkins just chose a path that's much harder than immediate firing, but also the right one. Mark asked again. Are you sure? Ella smiled slightly. Mark, if we want to change the airline industry, we can't start by leaving behind the people who need it most. Rachel couldn't help it any longer. She burst into tears, not from relief, but from the knowledge that she had just received a gift no one should have given her. Mrs. Hawkins, I don't know what to say. Ella looked at her, her voice softening as if placing her hand on a young person's broken heart. Speak with your actions, that's all. The personnel supervisors stood up and signed the minutes. Mark Sullivan concluded, the meeting is closed. The decision takes effect after sending the official notice. But the meeting wasn't really over, until Ella stood up, walking slowly towards Rachel. Miss Carter remained seated, not daring to look up. Ella placed a hand on her shoulder for the second time that day. Rachel, the pain of today will stay with you for the rest of your life. But if you let it teach you instead of torment you, you will be different. Rachel nodded, tears falling onto her clasped hands. And you will be better. The meeting adjourned. The lights went out, but in the long hallways of JFK Airport, where the yellow lights reflected off the polished floors, there were only two footsteps, Ella and Mark. Mark walked beside Ella for a while and then said, Are you sure that young man deserves this opportunity? Ella stopped, looked at him. No one is worthy from the start, Mark. People are only worthy when they start to change. Mark was silent for a moment. Then he smiled a rare, genuine smile. Maybe that's why she's the best CEO we've ever had. Ella didn't answer. But in the hallway light, her eyes reflected a very special strength, a strength born of patience, of grief, and of choosing not to retaliate, a power that very few have. Before their eyes is the future of an entire airline, and the future of a young girl named Rachel Carter who has just learned the hardest but most important lesson of her life. But the story isn't over yet. Another twist is waiting for you in the next part. The JFK airport corridors were strangely quiet at night. The yellow lights cast shadows on the shiny tiles, stretching out people's shadows like stretched memories, fragile and silent. Ella Hawkins walked slowly, Mark Sullivan beside her, but no one said anything more. The meeting was over, the decision had been made, but there was a long silence between them, a silence that Mark sensed but dared not touch. Only when they were near the private elevator of the executive area did Mark speak up, Mrs. Hawkins. I have never seen you so gentle. Ella smiled slightly. Mark, I'm not being gentle. I just chose a different direction. He looked at her closely as if trying to read something deeper. It was not easy to do what she did today. Ella stopped. She looked toward a large window where the light reflected her, face calm but with a hint of something very old, very far away. Not easy, she repeated, but necessary. Mark was silent. He sensed that today's meeting was just the surface. There was something underneath that had led Ella to make that decision, something not everyone knew. Finally, he asked Ella, what really happened to you back then? And that's when Ella's smile disappeared. At that moment, time seemed to go back many years. Mark, Ella said slowly, do you know when the first time I was dragged off a plane was? Mark was a little startled. She continued, when I was 19 years old. Just one sentence, but it made the whole space heavy. I worked part-time at a small store to buy tickets. It was my first trip. I wanted to fly to Atlanta to visit my dream college. Ella looked down at her hands as if seeing the trembling hands of the girl from years ago again. But when I boarded the plane, a flight attendant looked me up and down and said, you must have the wrong gate. Mark swallowed. I told her I had a ticket, but she didn't believe me. They called security. They dragged me down while everyone stared. I remember feeling so clearly, like I didn't belong, like I wasn't allowed to have even a small dream. Ella looked up, her eyes bright but gently pained. You ask why I don't fire a young person when they do the same thing to me. Her voice was small but deep, because I don't want to repeat the injury that took me years to get back on my feet. Mark sighed. That story, he had never heard it from Ella. No one had. He looked at her with much more respect than when he entered the meeting room. They reached the elevator. The doors opened, but Mark remained standing. Ella, you are stronger than anyone I have ever known, she replied with a thin smile. Being strong is something I had no choice but to learn. The two of them entered the elevator. But before the door could close, a voice rang out from the end of the hallway. Mrs. Hawkins. Wait, Ella turned around. Rachel Carter ran up, panting, her eyes red, her uniform still wrinkled from the meeting. Miss Carter, Mark frowned. You should go home. We've had enough for today. But Rachel shook her head, straightening up as if summoning up all her remaining courage. Sorry. I know I shouldn't be bothering you, but there's something I have to tell Mrs. Hawkins before I leave the airport. Ella didn't speak, just nodded slightly, a signal of permission. Rachel clenched her shirt tightly, but her eyes were extremely determined. I used to think this job would make me understand all kinds of people. But actually, I only understand people like me. Ella looked at her, her eyes so sympathetic that Rachel choked. I don't just want to right a wrong. I want to be part of the change you're trying to make. Mark was a little surprised. As if he didn't expect to hear that from Rachel, the girl who had torn up the airline CEO's ticket. Rachel took a deep breath. If I may, I would like to join the training program in the future. Not just to learn, but to help flight attendants like me see what I was previously blind to. Ella watched Rachel for a long time. So long that Rachel could barely breathe. Then Ella asked, "Why?" Rachel laughed, but it was a sad laugh. Because today, I saw myself in the eyes of the passengers I once misjudged, and I don't want anyone to see that look again. There was a long silence, but it was the kind of silence that made one believe that something important was about to be decided. Finally, Ella approached Rachel. Miss Carter, you are very young, and the best thing about young people is the ability to change faster than they think. Rachel took a deep breath. So, will you give me a chance? Ella smiled, light but supportive. I don't just give you an opportunity, I'll create it with you. At that moment, Rachel felt as if a year's burden had been lifted from her shoulders. She bowed deeply. Thank you so much. Ella placed her hand on Rachel's shoulder, more gentle than any apology Rachel had ever heard. The only thing I need from you is to be honest with yourself. As Rachel left, Mark looked at Ella and shook his head. Do you really believe she will change? Ella didn't answer right away. She watched Rachel run toward the parking lot, an awkward but effortful run. Then Ella said, I don't believe, I hope. Mark tilted his head. Hope is a risky strategy. Ella smiled deeply, full of experience, Mark. Sometimes hope is the only thing that keeps a person from being swallowed by bad things. The elevator doors opened again. Ella stepped in the elevator lights, illuminating her face, revealing strong features honed from a lifetime of endurance and standing. Before the door closed completely, Ella said, Tomorrow, I will start writing the new training program, and Miss Carter will be the first person I invite to be on the test group. Mark raised his eyebrows. Are you sure Ella is fine? No one understands mistakes, like the one who has made them. The elevator doors closed. The hallway returned to silence as if everything had just been a passing breeze. But no, because starting today, a major restructuring will begin at Horizon Atlantic Airlines, not by laws, not by punishment, but by people, through change, through dialogue, through stories like Ella's and Rachel's. And that journey has only just begun. There was a special silence in New York at night, the silence of a city accustomed to noise, but sometimes pausing as if to give every lost soul a place to breathe. Ella Hawkins sat in the company's private service car, her hands resting on her lap, her eyes looking out the window where the streetlights stretched into streaks of orange-yellow light. The driver kept the radio off. He knew that people coming out of heavy meetings often needed silence. Ella leaned her head back in the chair. She closed her eyes. But peace did not come as easily as she hoped. The image of the 9-year-old girl being dragged from the plane kept coming back to her, clear, sharp, painful, but also so familiar that she was no longer afraid. It was like a scar, no longer painful but always present. She whispered, not knowing whether to herself or to someone else. Maybe today is the first time I faced it without backing down. The car turned into the Horizon Atlantic Airlines operations area. A security guard bowed and opened the gate for the car to enter. But just then, Ella opened her eyes. For in front of the main building, she saw a man waiting. A tall, slightly thin figure, a long navy coat, a hat covering half of his face. Driver, also pay attention. Mrs. Hawkins. Do you want me to call security? Ella looked at the man for a few seconds, then shook her head. No need. I know that person. Her voice dropped so low that it made the listener feel his heart sink. As Ella stepped out of the car, the man slowly looked up. The streetlights slanted across his face, a hard, experienced face, but there was something in his eyes that made Ella's heart stop. "Hello, Ella." His voice was small, a little hoarse, as if he had come a long way to get here. Ella stood still. There was a silence so long that even the night wind dared not break. "It's been a while," the man continued. "I think it's time I saw you again." Ella looked at him, her eyes calm but deep, as if to drown the question in her heart. "What are you doing here, Daniel?" That's right. The man was Daniel Rhodes, a name no one in the company knew, but the one man who had gotten Ella to leave the airline industry years before. Not because of love, not because of conflict, but because of an incident that completely changed her life. And now Daniel stood right before her after more than 2 decades. "Ella," Daniel said, taking another step, "I came to talk about that year. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Ella didn't look flustered. Only the slight rise and fall of her shoulders, a small one, but enough to show she'd been preparing for this for a long time. "Daniel, what's done is done. I don't care anymore." But Daniel shook his head. "No, Ella. You think you don't care, but it's still there. It's still the reason you left the airline in the first place. And it's still the reason you chose to treat that flight attendant Rachel today." Ella was speechless. Not because he was wrong, but because he was so right that it made her heart sink. Daniel continued, "I heard about Gate 76. I heard how you handled it." Ella looked straight at him, her voice even. "And what are you here for? To say I'm too soft or too emotional?" Daniel shook his head. "I came to say that I was the one who made you lose your chance 20 years ago." The air compressed. So much so that Ella felt the air around her cool a degree. Daniel took a deep breath. "That year, the incident where you were dragged off the plane was not a mistake. It wasn't the flight attendant's fault. It wasn't the supervisor's fault." He looked at Ella, his eyes were both regretful and pleading for forgiveness. "I told them." Ella stood still, unblinking, unresponsive. Daniel continued, each word tearing from his throat. "I was young. I was ambitious. I was afraid you would surpass me. You were smart, talented, and had the attention of management. And I was worried you would get promoted first." He clenched his fists. "You told them there was a problem with my ticket. You interrupted the verification process. You made them suspect me so I could be pulled off the plane." The wind whistled through the hallway, as if to mask the cruelty of the confession. Ella looked at him silent as stone. Daniel continued, "I didn't think it would be this big. I thought they were just keeping you for further examination, but they dragged you down in front of everyone. When I saw, I wanted to stop, but it was too late." He stepped closer to Ella, only a step away. "Ella, I've carried that guilt for 20 years. I'm sorry." Ella closed her eyes. Just for a second. But that second weighed more than 20 years. When she opened her eyes, her voice was so calm it scared Daniel. "How do you think I will react?" Daniel swallowed. "I don't know, but I want you to know the truth." Ella took a step toward him. "Daniel, you ruined my first chance in life. You made me feel like I didn't belong anywhere in the sky. You kept me out of the aviation industry for years." Her voice wasn't angry, but it hurt a very real, very human pain. "And you think sorry is enough?" Daniel bowed his head. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know, you were never wrong. You were never wrong." There was a long silence. The New York night wind blew through the hallway again, carrying with it the distant sound of taxis passing by outside. Ella looked at the man who had broken her heart at the age of 19. And she said something that made Daniel unable to stand. "Daniel, I forgave you, a long time ago, but not because of you." He looked up, his eyes trembling. Ella continued, "But if I hadn't forgiven, I wouldn't be standing in this position today." She turned her back. "But forgiveness doesn't mean we have anything left to say to each other." Daniel wanted to call her back, but his voice choked. Ella walked. Her shadow stretched out on the tiles, strong, proud, self-possessed. Before turning into the hallway leading to her private office, Ella stopped, without turning around, just saying one sentence, low, deep, but echoing throughout the hallway. "Daniel, thank you. Because thanks to you, I learned that sometimes being pushed down is the only way to truly learn to stand up." Then she walked away. The glass doors opened automatically. The light from the office fell on Ella's face, highlighting the composure forged by a lifetime of effort. Daniel stood in the dark hallway. With sin it's too late, and the truth cannot be changed. The next morning, New York woke to a mild chill. Ella Hawkins entered her office through the back door, a habit she always maintained to avoid attracting undue attention. But today, she couldn't avoid it. Because just as she placed the hot cup of coffee on the desk, the door to the room opened. Mark Sullivan stood there, face tight, eyes strained. "Ella," he said, his voice lower than usual, "we have a big problem." Ella set down her cup, frowning slightly, not out of panic, but because she was used to seeing trouble as part of her job. "What happened?" Mark gave her the iPad. On the screen is the headline of the article that is at the top of the hot news section: "Flight attendant slaps black CEO. Airline tries to cover up incident." Ella breathed slowly, not angry, tired. She flipped to the video below the article. It was a clip taken from a distance at Gate 76. The image was unclear, but enough to see Rachel tearing up her ticket, enough to see Ella standing silently amidst the commotion. The audio in the clip was grainy, but the words, "She doesn't belong here," rang out clearly enough for viewers to completely misunderstand the story. Right below the video, thousands of comments scrolled. "Racism again. A black CEO being insulted in the middle of the airport. Unacceptable. This airline is terrible. Fire the flight attendants now." Mark looked at Ella. "I don't know who filmed this, but it's going viral. The union called me too." Ella was calmer than Mark expected. "How long before the mainstream media gets involved?" Mark replied. "By noon at the latest." In the airline's internal communications room, the phones rang constantly. Secretaries ran around the hallways. Internal newsletters were pouring in. In a small room not far from Ella's office, Rachel Carter sat silently in front of her phone screen. Her face was pale. She looked at the headline again, then at the video again, then at the series of messages from her colleagues. "Rachel, what happened? Are you really suspended? They said you slapped the CEO." "No, she didn't slap Ella." But the internet doesn't need the truth. She put the phone down, shaking so much she had to hold it with both hands to keep her breath. "Why did things turn out like this?" she muttered to herself. In her heart, the regret was heavier than last night. Not because she thought she would be fired, but because she didn't want Ella dragged into the storm she started. When Ella and Mark entered the press conference room, all the staff stood up. The communications director, Miss Harper Lane, stepped forward immediately. "Miss Hawkins, the video has gone national. We need to make a statement immediately." Ella sat down slowly. "What statement?" Harper glanced at Mark, then said, "We propose to announce that the incident has been investigated and the relevant staff will be disciplined. That will help calm the public." Ella frowned. "What about the truth?" Harper paused slightly. "Madam, the public doesn't care about the details. They care about the company's reaction. If we don't take strong action—" Ella raised her hand, signaling to stop. "Harper, I didn't build this airline by telling the public what they wanted to hear. I built it with the truth." The room was silent. Mark stood behind Ella with his arms crossed. His eyes were both worried and proud. Harper took a deep breath and said, "So, what do you want to declare?" Ella looked straight at the big screen, where the sensational newspaper headlines were still flashing. She said slowly, "I want to say that this video does not reflect the whole story. That I do not want anyone, even those who are wrong, to be judged based on something they cannot explain on camera." She paused for a moment, then continued, "I want to say that our responsibility is not to punish, but to change." Harper opened his eyes wide. "But the public will be angrier." Ella smiled slightly. "If the public gets angry because of kindness, we will take responsibility for that." In another corner of the facility, Rachel emerged from the mental health unit. Her eyes were red, but her steps were steadier than this morning. But as soon as she walked through the lobby, several employees whispered, "That's her. I heard the CEO was humiliated but still forgave her. She'll be fired, believe me." She heard everything, but did not react. She just kept walking because shame sometimes lies not in what other people say, but in knowing you've done something wrong. As she approached the elevator, the doors opened. Ella Hawkins stepped out. Rachel stood there, stunned. Mrs. Hawkins." Ella looked at Rachel. Her eyes held neither anger nor reproach. "Miss Carter," she said, "have you seen the video?" Rachel nodded, her eyes wet. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to turn out like this. I didn't want you to be dragged into this chaos." "Ella, gently, I know." she hiccuped softly. Are you angry with me? Ella shook her head. What I am angry about is that the truth is being twisted to become entertainment. Rachel bowed her head. Do you want me to speak out publicly? I am willing to say I am wrong. I am willing to take responsibility before the media. Ella looked at her for a long moment, then said something that made Rachel almost cry with relief and pain at the same time. Miss Carter, responsibility isn't always about standing before the public. Sometimes responsibility is standing before yourself. Rachel covered her mouth not from embarrassment, but from a gratitude she couldn't express in words. Ella continued, I will speak up. I will say my piece. Rachel's voice trembled. What about me? Ella placed her hand on her shoulder, an action that took Rachel's breath away in surprise. You will change, and that is the most powerful answer. At the same time, on social media, an anonymous account posted another video, clearer, longer, and most importantly, recorded the entire conversation at Gate 76 without editing. No one knows who filmed it. But the video shows that Ella wasn't angry, didn't insult anyone, didn't say anything disrespectful. And it also shows that Rachel was surprised, not intentionally malicious, but reacted wrongly because of a hasty judgment. Below the video, the comments started to change direction. Wait, it doesn't seem like the CEO ever yelled. She looked really calm. And the flight attendant, she seemed more panicked than malicious. Maybe we don't know the full story. A new media storm began, but this time it wasn't directed against anyone. It opened up something neither the public nor Horizon Atlantic had ever seen coming. The truth is not simple, but kindness can make all the difference. In the afternoon, Ella stepped up to the press conference podium. The light fell on her face, calm, composed, steady, as someone who had weathered many storms. She looked into the dozens of cameras in front of her and said the opening line that silenced America. In this story, there are no villains. There are only humans, and humans are sometimes wrong. The press room was packed. The white lights from dozens of cameras focused on the face of Ella Hawkins, a black woman standing at the center of a media storm, but not trembling in the slightest. Even veteran journalists could tell that her composure was not the composure of power, but the composure of someone who had been through enough pain to no longer fear a look. Ella looked around the room, then said softly, "Thank you all for coming. Before I share this story, I want to remind you, this is not a story about a slap. This is not a story about racism. And it is not a story about anger." She paused for a beat. The silence tilted the room toward her. This is a story about people. The sound of cameras clicking was heard. Ella continued. 3 days ago at Gate 76, there was an incident. One of our flight attendants, Miss Rachel Carter, acted unprofessionally. The video went viral and caused outrage. Several journalists nodded pens, ready to jot down every detail. Ella placed her hands on the podium and bowed slightly. But what people don't see is that she apologized immediately afterward. She admitted her mistake. And she's changing. The room was in an uproar. No one expected the CEO to say that. I want to be clear, I am not offended. I am not weak. I do not need anyone to protect me. But we all of us need to look deeper into the truth. Then Ella told her own story. No embellishment, no drama, just a black woman who was pulled from a plane at 19 who thought she didn't belong in the sky, and who spent years trying to get back on her feet. I know what it feels like to be judged by your appearance. I know what it feels like to be looked down upon. That's why I don't want to see anyone else go through the same thing. The meeting room was frozen. Ella concluded, Miss Carter was wrong, but I don't want to punish her. I want to help her become a better person. An elderly journalist stood up and asked Mrs. Hawkins, aren't you afraid that the public will misunderstand? That you're too soft, Ella smiled, a smile that softened the air like thin snow melting in the sun. I'm not afraid of being misunderstood. I'm just afraid of living in a world where people don't get a second chance. The journalist put down his pen, no further questions. After the press conference, news sites began to change their tone. Black CEO handles crisis with kindness. A two-sided story when the truth is more complicated than it seems. Ella Hawkins' calm response makes people think again. And then the unexpected #G. Thousands of people share about the times they made mistakes and were forgiven, about the scars they carry, about the people who once reached out to help them stand up. The story is no longer a scandal. It becomes a reminder of humanity. That evening, in the quiet of her office, Ella sat in front of the large window overlooking the airport. The planes were parked quietly under the lights like giant sleeping birds. There was a soft knock at the door. "Come in," Ella said. The door opened. Rachel Carter stepped in, looking timid, but her eyes were different. Not the eyes of fear, but the eyes of someone who knew she had changed. "Mrs. Hawkins, I saw the press conference." Rachel's voice was shaky but full of emotion. "Ella Dua, what do you think, son? I don't deserve your protection." Ella shook her head. Rachel's tears fell immediately. She approached the table and said, sobbing, "Mrs. Hawkins, today I understand. You didn't just forgive me. You taught me how to see the person behind the mistake. Rachel nodded vigorously. She good, because opportunity is not given. It is built by choice." Rachel. He held up a new set of documents. Ella H. And Ella, she Mark. Mark nodded slowly, as if absorbing every word. That night, as Ella stepped out of the airline building, the New York wind brushed her face cool and light, as if touching a part of her no one else could see. She stopped on the steps. She looked up at the sky over the airport. Under the yellow lights, the runways were as long as the road she had walked all her life. Bumpy, sometimes dark, sometimes bright, but always leading in the same direction forward. N-A. Very light word, but contains a whole journey of healing. Not just for her, but for people who have been through the same trauma as her, people who are learning to pick themselves up and move on. And if you're reading this, if you've ever been misunderstood, if you've ever made a mistake, if you've ever been judged unfairly, then perhaps you will understand what Ella wants to convey. Everyone deserves a second chance. Everyone deserves a sky of their own. If you find this story touching, please like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss out on the next humane stories. Thank you for accompanying us until the end.